Off. We've got 2 minutes. Let's start spotlighting people. Adi, Paul, Rabbi, tech support. Adi, you can tell that I've learned that I have to rename myself, otherwise. People are now starting to come in. We had 100, and just to let you guys know what we ended up doing, let me hit refresh here. Helps if I hit refresh on the right thing.
Wow.
So in total for tonight, we had 129 devices registered.
Wow.
And in donations, we've collected $588 in donations.
Nice.
Paul, thank you very much. You're a draw. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. I hope it will be interesting. I hope there'll be provocative questions.
David, something was hacked? I'm seeing the chat now. Numbers are slowing up. We'll give it another minute or two and then we'll start up. We see the chat's working. Always good. Good evening. We're up to 70. We'll give it another minute. Wait till the number goes up to 74, 75 for a little bit, and then we'll start up. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Give it another minute. All right. I think we'll begin. We're recording. We are good to go. So hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's session, tonight's evening of Everybody Has a Story, featuring Paul Hirschson, our Consul General, moderated by Adi Varon, who, when I was trying to think of how to introduce her, I remembered very clearly when she first came to Montreal, I got a text from her introducing herself to me that read, "Hi, Stu, my name is Adi. I'm replacing her predecessor. Next to your name, it just says you're a good person to reach out to and that I should connect with you about everything, so I'm reaching out." Since then, I can tell you that Adi has been a phenomenal, wonderful friend to Adav. What seems like a long time ago, but it was really just in December for our Hanukkah party. She was there for our bubble party, and she's been coming to so many wonderful events. She's been working very closely with our Shinshanit over the years. And when it came time for us to try to identify somebody to moderate with our Consul General, she really was the first person who came to mind. So with that, I'd like to hand the metaphorical microphone over to Adi, and I'd like to remind everybody that tonight's session is being recorded and that you can enable closed captioning down below. Adi, it's yours.
Thank you so much for the opening and the kind words. And thank you for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see some recognized face from the previous years when we could see each other in person. It's a great honor for me to introduce Consul General Mr. Paul Hirschson. Before I introduce him, I would like to remind you that the chat box is open. You can either send your comment in the general group or directly to me at Adi Varon. And at the Q&A session after, I would represent your questions. So please feel free to submit any questions that you may have during Mr. Hirschson's conversation. So, as I said, I'm honored to present Consul General Mr. Paul Hirschson, who grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa. He holds bachelor's in both accounting and law and master's in business degrees. After immigrating to Israel, Paul served the IDF, then worked in the public sector, relocating to England for 3 years. On his return to Israel, Paul entered Israel's high-tech sector, developing business relations with Arab countries and later in Europe, Africa, Malaysia, and beyond. Paul spent 10 years in Israel high-tech sector. In 2004, Paul left private sector and joined Israel Foreign Ministry, becoming Israel's first diplomat posted in the United Arab Emirates 15 years before the establishment of diplomatic relation in 2020. In 2008, Paul re-elected to the United States of America. In 2011, Paul completed his posting in the United States of America and returned home to Israel, where he served as a spokesperson in the Foreign Ministry for 4 years. In 2015, Paul was appointed as Israel ambassador to Senegal and 5 other countries in West Africa. Paul ran the Israeli embassy in Dakar until returning to Israel in late 2018. In 2019, Ambassador Hirschson took on responsibility for Israel relations with Caribbean countries. He appointed Israel's next Consul General to Quebec and Atlantic Canada and moved to Montreal this summer. When not on walking, Paul spends his time speaking on his cell phone and drinking coffee. You can follow Paul on Twitter, and he is very active on social media when he responds to any comment. With, again, great pleasure, Paul, I'm handing out the floor to you.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you, Rabbi Whitman, for the invitation, and everybody here. I have been here a few months and I'm starting to recognize a couple of people. I see my friend Jack Altman is here, and a couple of other people. I also realize when I see how many people I don't know, how much more work I have to do to get out into the community, the Jewish community and beyond. So it's lovely to be here, and thank you everybody for joining us. I was asked to speak about the first days, the early days of the opening of a conversation, I call it, more than relations or ties, with the United Arab Emirates. But I'd like to start with an anecdote from my time as the ambassador in West Africa, in Dakar, Senegal, or based in Dakar, Senegal, covering a number of countries in West Africa, because I think it is relevant. Prior to my going to West Africa, there were two countries in my portfolio in West Africa with which Israel did not have diplomatic relations, Mali and Guinea. Mali, we still don't have diplomatic relations with. And I did a little bit of research because I had spent 3 years in the Emirates working on this idea that Israel has of establishing relations with countries we don't have relations with. And it fascinated me. Both of these countries, Guinea and Mali, were Muslim majority countries similar to the United Arab Emirates, and with similar reasons to some degree for not having relations with us at the time. Guinea had been the only country in Africa, which broke relations with Israel after the 6-Day War. All of the other countries, if those of you who know the history of Israel's relations in Africa will know that there was a major crisis between Israel and almost all African countries around the Yom Kippur War in 73. Guinea was the only country which broke relations with Israel in 67 and had never renewed them. So when I arrived in Dakar, and almost the first thing I did was I reached out to the Guinea ambassador to Senegal, asked if I could meet him. He said yes. I went over to him. We sat, we had coffee, as Adi pointed out. We were chatting, and after a while I said to him, you know, I know why relations were cut. I was trying to be polite. I didn't want to remind him that they had cut relations with us and not us with them. I said, but I did a lot of work prior to coming out to West Africa, and I haven't found a real logical, cogent reason why relations haven't been renewed. I think I took him by surprise. I'm not sure he was much of an expert on Israel or the Middle East. His responsibilities were, he was Guinea's ambassador to Senegal. He was a very local West African guy. So he said to me, I don't know. He says, I have no idea. He says, if you want, I can check up. I said to him, yes, please, I'd love that. And about 3 weeks later, he called me back. I've been a month and a half in West Africa at the time. He says to me, Paul, come over for a coffee. So I went over back to his embassy. We sat down, we chatted. He looked at me. He said to me, you remember what you asked me? I said, yes, I remember very well. This is one of my major goals that I had set for myself. He says, well, I checked up. He says, we also don't know why we haven't reinstalled relations. And I sent a report back home to Israel. I said, told him we don't know why we haven't renewed relations. He answered, he said that they also don't know why. And about 8 months later, I became Israel's first ambassador in 49 years to Guinea, in addition to Senegal and some of the other countries in West Africa. And why do I bring this up? That was what I sort of call a little bit of what I define as accidental diplomacy. We stumbled into relations. It turned out nobody had ever asked. The building of ties and relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates was the exact opposite. It was a long, hard, thought out, considered, planned strategy, which took us a lot longer than we thought it would take. There was nothing accidental about it. This was one of Israel's best kept secrets. This was one of Israel's greatest aspirations. Many of us put many years into developing this. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the early days. We've only got until midnight, so we won't be able to cover all of it, but I'll try get through as much of it as possible. So establishing ties with the Arab world has always been pretty much Israel's #1 strategic goal. Relations with the United States is up there, and I don't think there's anything else that I could point to that would be higher on Israel's strategic list than furthering, deepening, widening, broadening our ties into the Arab world. Madrid Conference, October 1991, after the first Gulf War, was the first time we already had at that point a peace treaty with Egypt, the Arab world's most significant player. with apologies to all of the other Arab countries. But we had no ties or no official ties to anybody else. There was a little bit of business that was going on. I was soon to start doing business in the Arab world. There were some, very little, but some people who were already doing business in the Arab world outside of Egypt. After the first Gulf War, it was the first time, the Madrid conference, where Israel and almost everybody in the Arab world sat down in public. The Syrians were there, the Saudis were there, the Emiratis were there, others were there. Arising out of that conference at a few years down the road was the peace treaty with Egypt. Arising out of that conference in a convoluted way were the initial agreements we have with the Palestinians to this day. And arising out of that conference in October 1991 were also conversations between an Israeli diplomat and a very, very, very senior, significant member of the inner circle of the royal family in Abu Dhabi, and a few other conversations. And Israel started a conversation which was by telephone, which was by periodic meetings in Washington, also other places in the world. Nothing really happened. It was just an exchange of ideas, an exchange of views, slowly getting to know each other. Now, there were a number of different tracks that we traveled down at the same time. There was the official conversation that the foreign ministry, I was not a member of the foreign ministry at the time, that the foreign ministry had. And there were also individuals like myself and one or two other people who stumbled into the question of Israel and the United Arab Emirates. In 1994, Adi mentioned I returned to Israel from 3 years in the United Kingdom, during which time I had some conversations with Arabs that I met in the United Kingdom. I went into business in the high-tech sector, and relatively soon I focused on establishing ties between Israel and companies in the Arab world, first in Egypt, then in Jordan, prior to the peace treaty with Jordan. Relatively soon, I realized that in Jordan, there were a lot of people who wanted to do business, especially when the peace treaty was signed. But there was not enough of an ability. It's not a particularly wealthy country, and I needed to find people who had more of an ability. Turned my attention to the Gulf, and I went down. My first visit actually was to Kuwait in 1995, which was triggered, to be honest, by an event which I'm sure none of you would expect me to connect to Israel's relations with the United Arab Emirates. But in 1994, about 6-7 months before my first visit to the Gulf, newly elected president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, went on an official trip to Abu Dhabi. I think it may have been his first trip as president of South Africa, his first overseas trip. Took with him, as presidents do, a business delegation. As it turned out, there was one Jewish chap on the business delegation that went with Mandela. And they arrived in Abu Dhabi, and the South African business delegation was basically distributed amongst the sons of the then president, President Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, each according to the area that they worked in. David, the South African Jew, was twinned with a member of the royal family, the person who today, but not then, today is the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates. They started doing business in a number of sectors, and it took a while before David had, it took actually a year or 2 or 3 years before David had was brave enough to turn around to this member of the royal family and say to him, what about Israel? And the response coming from the member of the royal family was, that's not for me, that's my brother, which was one of the times that we got lucky. His brother, he was talking about the crown prince. Now, the interesting thing in the Emirates is there were 19 sons of the president. It mattered not who the father was. it mattered who the mother was. These were 19 sons from 4 different mothers, and it just so happened that this particular son shared the same mother as the crown prince. Wasn't then the crown prince, today the crown prince. The president Zayed was still alive, so he was the second in line out of the sons. And a meeting was set up with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, today Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, where David said to him, "What about Israel?" And Sheikh Mohammed turned around to him, looked at him and said to him, "Okay, yes." We were talking about business relations in some serious industries. And another peg was put into the sand. There were others as well. And we slowly started making indents into the Emirates. In 1995, I paid my first visit, 1994 to Kuwait, 1995 to the Emirates. And it was on my second night there. My first night was in Abu Dhabi. My second night was in Dubai. On my second night there, I went out for dinner with 2 sons and a father that I had started doing business with. In the middle of the dinner, the father turned around to me and he said to me in slightly more crude words than I would use here. He said to me, "It's just a hill." He was talking about the Golan Heights. I didn't know it at the time. He said to me, "Keep it, give it away, blow it up. I don't care, but just get over with it already. You're making it difficult for me to do business." That was the moment I realized, 32 years old, not in the foreign ministry, that a deal was doable. I didn't think it would take 25 years. I thought we could do it in the next 25 months, perhaps. Not the business deal that we were negotiating, that as well, but the big deal, the strategic deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And different people linked up. I met the Israeli diplomat who had started coming on visits every month, every 2 months. He was coming as often as he could. I started doing more business. Other people started doing a little bit of business. We started seeing the beginning of a network of people in different industries. Over the years, we built 4 farms in the United Arab Emirates, in 3 different emirates of the 7 emirates. 3 of the 4, I think, still exist, and 1 was a failure. And then jumping forward a bit, because otherwise we will be here until midnight tonight. In 2004, partially related and partially unrelated, I left the private sector and joined the foreign ministry 17, 18 years ago. We had already been doing business for about 10 years in the Emirates. I thought that we would have finished the deal to do relations with the Emirates 8 years earlier. And at that point, we had barely begun. And in 2005, myself and 1 other Israeli diplomat went down to the United Arab Emirates to set up what we called a fake embassy. There were no relations, there were no agreements. To the best of my knowledge, this is the only time it's ever been done by Israel or by any country in the world. This is not what diplomats do. Diplomats generally engage with a country after relations are established, not before, or certainly not in this way. And we went down, the 2 of us, to the United Arab Emirates in 2005, early 2005, where we started to craft a cogent strategy for how we could build relations with the United Arab Emirates. And the foundation stone to the idea was that, so I love my sport, but in sport, somebody has to lose. Except, of course, that British game which you can play for 5 days and it ends in a draw, cricket. But with that one exception, in sport, somebody has to lose. Now, it's cool when my side wins, but when my side loses, it's a horrible feeling. Business is perhaps the exact opposite to sport. The only way that business works is when both sides win. And the idea was that we would build a business relationship between ourselves and the Emirates, that we would get to a point, the strategic goal was to get to a point where figuratively, too many people, too highly positioned, would be too heavily invested in the process of doing business between ourselves and the Emirates for this to be reversible. And that's precisely what happened. Only it took many, many years longer than I, at the beginning, had expected or hoped for. On a side note, perhaps relevant, perhaps irrelevant to this particular conversation, I'll just say this, you know, there is a lot of talk out there today by, I don't know whether it's the pro-Palestinian crowd or the anti-Israel crowd, of boycotting Israel. And it's fascinating to sit on the side and to watch this and to think to myself that the most significant successful strategy for building ties between Israel and the Arab world was I mean, to be fair, we have a relationship with Egypt that goes back a lot longer, but if you look at what's happening with the Emirates today, was based on the strategy of business. Diametrically, the exact opposite of the idea of boycotting Israel. You see, this is the thing. When you do business, especially international business, you're traveling all the time, you're visiting them all the time, you're having meetings, and eventually at some point you go out for dinner. And at dinner, you stop speaking about the deal and you start speaking about family, and you speak about sport, you speak about literature, and you speak about politics, and you get to know each other and you make friends. And there was an entire network of, over the years, hundreds and hundreds of Israeli business people who were getting to know Emirati business people, not just doing business, not just both sides making money, but getting to know each other. And then they would meet at exhibitions in Spain and in Germany and in America and around the world. And then on occasion, the Emiratis would come to Israel. I can give you one example. We built, by the way, the Dubai Diamond Exchange, which is a massive, massive project and an incredible gain for Israel in terms of building the relationship between the two. But at one point, the head of the Dubai Diamond Exchange came to me. He said to me, Paul, he said, it's the annual World Federation of Diamond Bursot conference. This year it's in Israel. One year it was in Tokyo. One year it was in Brussels. One year it was in New York. This year it was in Tel Aviv, he says to me. It was actually Ramat Gan, but he said Tel Aviv. He said, I want to go. It was his first ever visit to Israel. I said to him, wonderful. I said, we'll arrange it. And off he went to Israel. Shorten the story, he comes back from Israel, and the first thing he does, 7 in the morning, getting back to the Emirates, is he goes to report back to the ruler. He didn't need, him and his family, didn't need anybody saying that behind their backs that they were hanging out with the Israelis. He walked in through the front door of the palace, had a meeting arranged with the ruler, and gave him a report back. Obviously, he had gotten permission in advance to go. And I waited for him. I met him after the meeting with the ruler. I said to him, Ahmed bin Sulaim. It's actually a liberating experience, I must say, being in Montreal, because until a year ago, all of this was classified and I didn't tell anybody any of this. And all of a sudden, I'm able to speak about much, not all of the stories. I said to him, Ahmed, I said, how was the meeting with the ruler? He said, no, it was wonderful. I said, well, what did you tell him? He looked at me with a little smile on his face. He said to me, I told him that I went to visit the cousins. And this is precisely what was happening. A family relationship was being built, or alternatively, you could argue being rebuilt. I could go further into it. I'll give you 1 or 2 anecdotes to give you an idea about how it felt. So one night I moved down there in 2005. We didn't have an office. There was no embassy. There was no consulate. There were 2 of us there, 2 Israeli diplomats. I was with my family. My children went into school. I've never really told anybody this particular story. I was so embarrassed about it. But the first Israeli product that we imported to the Emirates, I get an email from the school. My children were 5 years old. We had just gotten back from actually a visit. I arrived in the Emirates in summer 2005, and Chanukah 2005. We went for a week's visit to Israel, back to the Emirates, and my kids went back to school. I get an email from the school saying 40 or 50 of the children at school have been sent home. They have lice. And will you all please check your children? I phoned my then wife. I said to her, it was us, correct? She says to me, yeah, they're home. They're home, the two of them, the two twins at the time, 5 years old. I said to her, no, it was us. Not they've got it. We did it. She said, what do you mean? I said, there are no lice in the United Arab Emirates. We had been on holiday in Israel. The school was horrified. They shut the school down the next day. I said to her, to my wife, I said to her, just don't tell anybody. Just keep quiet. We were the only people at the school who knew what to do. My children were like lice magnets. Israel is cursed with lice. I got a phone call a couple of months in from a very, very, very senior person in the Emirates. He says to me, Paul, it was about 11 o'clock at night. He says to me, Paul, come, I'm sitting with some friends. You got to come down to this restaurant. I wasn't going to say no to this senior person. I said to him, okay, I'm on the way. I got there close to midnight. They finished eating. They were having coffee. About 6 or 7 of them sitting around a table. And he says to me, Paul, I want you to meet my friend Ahmed. He says, he turns to Ahmed. He says, this is my friend Paul. He says, the two of you need to speak. So I gave him my business card, which was the business card of a businessman. No indication of Israel on it whatsoever. And he gave me his business card. I had a look at it. It said the Director of Customs, which was when I knew what I wanted from him. He had no idea what I wanted or what he wanted from the conversation. Anyway, we chatted for a bit. I said I'd phone him, which I did the next day, and went down to see him a couple of days later. Director of Customs, I'm sitting in his office. He says to me, after a while, he says, so what do you do? Why are we meeting? And because of who introduced us, I knew I could speak openly. And I turned around to Ahmed Bouti, Director of Customs, very senior position. I said to him, look, I do a lot of business here in the Emirates and with Israeli companies. I said, so I need to bring all of this produce into the Emirates. Now, the problem is that you're abiding by the Arab boycott of Israel at the time. So it's illegal, and your job as Director of Customs is to stop me. And so I need to sit with you and figure out how we can solve this. And I started explaining to him how I thought we could do it. He stopped me in mid-sentence. He looked at me. He said to me, Paul, he said, what do you know about international shipping and freight forwarding? So I couldn't tell him I didn't really know anything. So I said, I know the basics. And he looked at me, he says to me, well, I'll tell you how we're going to do it. And he gave me a much simpler and easier system than I had imagined. He says to me, when you tell your shipping agent to come to customs, there's a document called a certificate of origin. I said to him, exactly. I said, this is the problem. I don't know those of you who've done any international trade. A certificate of origin is the certificate which monitors every single good that comes in or out of a country, where it's made, what percentage is from Israel, what percentage is from another country. This is how the world measures where trade is from. I said to him, yes, this is exactly the issue, the certificate of origin. He says, so you tell your customs guys, when they come to customs, you tell them to say that they've lost their certificate of origin. I said to him, what are you talking about? Now what happens? There is nowhere in the world that you can do importing or exporting without a certificate of origin. He says to me, well, no, he says, I'm going to fine you $30. And for 17 years, From 2005 until about 18 months ago, when we established official relations with the United Arab Emirates, every shipment of Israeli produce into the United Arab Emirates has been fined $30. Now, they're not Christians, so they don't have a Christmas party. I think we were financing one of their Ramadan iftars, maybe, on an annual basis. They would take these $30 fines and have a little office party. Perhaps for them, for the customs in the United Arab Emirates, the saddest part of the establishment of diplomatic relations was they have to stop fining us $30 per shipment. It's an incredible thing how over time the Israeli high-tech and other sectors learned that they had to factor $30 into the $100,000 deals or the $200,000 deals. They had to allocate a $30 fine that got paid for losing the certificate of origin. It was a spectacular experience. We showed an Israeli film at a film festival. We brought in, we had an art exhibition of an Israeli artist. We brought in Israelis on an almost daily basis. On one occasion, one of the Israeli business people forgot his Israeli passport in the safe of the hotel room, which was a nightmare, a small one. There were bigger nightmares than that. And we slowly built a network of ties, of relations, which established a basis of trust on which this relationship moved further and further forward. A whole bunch of anecdotes, we'll maybe get into them during a conversation and a question issue. I want to just say this. We understood that for 30 years, Israel, the Arab world, the Americans, the international community, everybody had slowly drifted towards the idea that, in fact, it was official policy of the Arab League that Israel and the Palestinians would do a deal, and as a byproduct of that deal, Israel would get relations with the entire Arab world, perhaps even better than that, with the entire Muslim world. Turns out this was a false premise. Turns out this was the concept was wrong from the beginning. And we should have known, because we already had a peace treaty with Egypt. We already had a relationship with an Arab country, the most significant player in the Arab world, prior to having an agreement with the Palestinians, but we all got blinded. It was never going to happen that way. It was never, ever going to be what I call inside out. It was always going to be outside in. It was never going to be, you do a deal, Israel and the Palestinians, and as a byproduct, you get relations with the Arab world. It was always going to be, and now it started. You do a deal with the Arab world, and as a byproduct, there will be an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, whatever that agreement looks like. It may end up being the same one that everybody's been talking about, but the process is the opposite. And the reason for this is relatively simple. Assuming that the Palestinians were to give us everything that we want, and by definition they can't, because we're Israelis, we're greedy, we want everything, which would leave nothing for anybody else. But assuming that they were to give us absolutely everything that we want from them, the risks that Israel is being asked to undertake, and that we will undertake, cannot be justified, cannot be underwritten, cannot be warranted by anything that the Palestinians give us. I'll give you two simple examples. It doesn't matter whether they want to or they don't want to, they simply cannot give us overflight rights over Saudi Arabia. So it's not within their authority. Without having overflight rights over Saudi Arabia, the Israeli business community, which is commuting out to Asia, to China, to India, and elsewhere, cannot fly El Al. It's too expensive because El Al has to go a circuitous route all the way around Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, we had established a semi-solution to by getting an agreement with the Emirates and with one or two other countries in the Gulf, that Israelis were allowed to transit through their airports. In other words, a bus route was established from Tel Aviv to Amman. From Amman, they would fly, land in Abu Dhabi, transit, not leave the airport, transit to a plane flying out to Asia. It saved a lot of time and it saved a lot of money, but it still wasn't good enough. And in the other direction, it doesn't matter whether the Palestinians would want to or didn't want to, they simply couldn't ever give us overflight rights over Sudan. If you have a look at the map of the world, for us to fly to Brazil, we need to traverse Sudan. Without doing that, you have to fly all the way down the Red Sea, turn right over Kenya, and it adds 3-4 hours of flight, which is over the years, tens of millions of dollars of plane tickets, more. The only way we could square the circle of justifying Israel undertaking the risks that Israel is going to undertake is if we turn it upside down. Or alternatively, you could argue, turn it the correct way around. And that is that Israel does a deal with the Arab world. If you remember, most of you, when we were growing up, it was always the Arab-Israel conflict. It was never the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We were just going back to what it always was. Do a deal with the Arab world. Israel today is not in the first division. I mean, we're not China or the United States or Germany or Japan or India, but we certainly are a relevant player. We need to do a deal with Saudi, with the Emirates, in the future with the major players in the Arab world, maybe Syria, Iraq. And as a byproduct, there will be an agreement with the Palestinians. And you saw just 18 months ago that Morocco joined in. I didn't work on the Morocco portfolio ever, although I did visit Morocco once. And this is a game changer. The relationships today, despite the protests that you saw in Montreal outside the Israeli consulate in May, 6-8 months ago, the relationship today between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East is better than it's ever been in history. I'll say that again. The relationship today between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East is better than it's ever been in history. Think about it. Not only in the Middle East, but in Israel. The first time in the history of Israel, there is an Arab majority political party which is a member of the government. I know that there are different people who are listening today who have got different ideas and beliefs about Israel. And I'll tell you this, and we all know it. It doesn't matter who put together the Israeli government. In the last elections in Israel, every single possible constellation, every single possible prime minister was including an Arab party in the coalition. Relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel and in the Middle East have never, ever been as good as they are today, which doesn't mean we haven't got a long way to go. I've got 100 stories to tell about the Emirates, but Adi, I think I'm going to pause and let's see if we can take some questions. I'll just say one comment about questions, and that is this. The more you challenge me, the more you disagree with me, the happier I am.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think it really leads to one of the questions that have been asked. And on a personal note, I would say that this is fascinating. One of the questions that submitted by Mark asking, what is former Prime Minister Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu's influence on the stories that you had now shared and about the agreement that was recently signed between Israel and the Emirates.
So I first visited the United Arab Emirates in 1995. I didn't think it was going to take 25 years to put the deal together. At the time, I thought this was no big deal. We could put it together in a couple of months, a year or two. Turned out that it was a lot more difficult and took a lot longer, and there were a lot more players than I thought would be required. Prime Minister Netanyahu was Prime Minister of Israel twice, the second time for over a decade. And obviously he was fully briefed on everything. I like to say, I think it's even true, that he adopted my approach, that I was there before him in terms of it's outside in, not inside out, that the deal has to be done with the Arab world. And as a byproduct, there will be an agreement with the Palestinians. I think if you listen to or read the things that he said and wrote and did over the years, you will see that this is precisely the line of thought that he adopted over the years. I will say this, and that is that when we were sent, myself and one other guy, when we were actually sent out with the agreement of the Emiratis to be on a permanent basis in the Emirates and to actually work on establishing the infrastructure of both business and strategic relations with the Emirates, the Prime Minister at the time, the person who authorized the project, was Arik Sharon. But you know, it was transferred from him to Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister, and it was transferred from him to Prime Minister Netanyahu at the time, and all three of them, plus a number of foreign ministers along the way. Silvan Shalom was the foreign minister. When it first happened, there were 10 of us in Israel who knew about the project. The 10th one was my wife. I had to tell her because she was coming with me. The 9th of the 10 was Prime Minister Arik Sharon, who authorized it. Without his authorization, it wouldn't have happened. But all three of the prime ministers and Silvan Shalom after him, Tzipi Livni after her, through a number of foreign ministers, were 100% supportive. And the fascinating thing is that other than rumors, nothing ever leaked. To be fair, there was an official, I'm translating from Hebrew here, they weren't allowed, the media was not allowed to publish my name. It's an interesting experience because if you Google my name, there's nothing prior to 2008. I didn't exist before then, which was when I left the Emirates, left being there permanently. But it was an incredible thing to see the political echelon of Israel. When it counted, there was nothing that leaked. Absolutely nothing. When it counted, nothing was leaked. So I think that a lot of people get credit, and Prime Minister Netanyahu gets a lot of credit. He understood it, he saw it, he supported it, he backed it, he drove it forward, and it took a certain constellation of the stars for the deal to be finalized. He's not the only person, but without him, it wouldn't have happened.
Thank you. There are several questions in the chat, so please continue sending them. Thank you. Another question that is related to what you just shared about the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is another question that how important is the United States involvement with Israel's relations with the Arab state? And I want to add on that question another question that is related. Do the Arab states that have made peace with Israel have continued relations with Palestinians? So I think those two questions can be answered together.
Excellent question. So first of all, I said towards the beginning that perhaps the The only other issue, which is at the top of Israel's international strategic goals, is the relationship with the United States of America. The United States of America is Israel's best friend, biggest partner, has been. If you look at the history of Israel, the relationship was always good. The relationship was good from Truman in the 1948, but it turned into a strategic relationship immediately following on the 7th day of the Six-Day War. Conceptually, the day after the Six-Day War was when the relationship turned into a strategic relationship at the initiation of the Americans, not of the Israelis, and including former President Trump. There has been dramatic support for Israel, and I don't think that the relationship with the Emirates was going to happen anyway. They wanted it no less than we wanted it, and other countries in the Arab world as well. But the timing was critical. And it was sometimes a little frustrating because I was like, let's just do it. We both want it. But there was something in the air that needed to happen. Some people will throw out Iran. It wasn't only Iran. Some people throw out other issues. And the Americans did a lot for this to happen. Also, the relationship with Morocco, with Bahrain, with Sudan, we just received, as you know, probably overflight rights over Saudi Arabia without diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis agreed to that. Massive a step forward in terms of peacemaking. Make no mistake about it. All of these countries and all of the rest that we haven't yet finalized a deal with still support the Palestinian Arabs. Absolutely. That doesn't mean that they support this or another specific formula for what will be the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs. They are deeply invested in their own interests, and their own interests include the entire spectrum of the Arab world, including the Palestinian Arabs. The change that is happening, and it's fascinating to see, because when you look here in Montreal and other places in North America and around the globe, and you see today the pockets, some of them very significant pockets, but pockets of antagonism towards Israel. If for anybody who's actually been involved, like I've had the privilege to be, in the building of ties with the Arab world, it's fascinating to see that this antagonism to Israel is 20 years behind where the Arab world is today. They are very supportive of the Palestinians, but there is a growing and very, very significant parallel trend, which says, okay, number one, we are able to have a relationship with the Jews at the same time as having a relationship with the Palestinians or with ourselves, as it were, the Arabs. There's no reason for us not to have these two relationships at the same time. In fact, the opposite. Anybody who is interested in conflict resolution will do everything that they possibly can to progress and advance business relations between Israelis and Palestinians, between Israelis and Syrians, between Israelis and Lebanese, between Israelis and all members of the Arab people, because the more business that happens, the more we get to know each other, the more we both benefit, and the more we get to like each other. So the change is not that the Emirates, Abu Dhabi has invested in the Gaza Strip significantly. The change is not that the Emirates have said we're fed up with the Palestinians. They sometimes are, but not got anything to do with us. And we're no longer going to support them. The change is, in order to support them, we need to build ties with Israel.
a follow-up question to that would be, again, if it's okay, I will combine two questions, which
Please.
I think kind of related to one another. So one of the questions is, aside from their depends on oil, what kind of industries is being developed in the UAE? And another question that is also involved with what you just said about, and you said earlier when you spoke about El Al flights. So one of the questions is, why have there never been El Al flights directly from Tel Aviv to Buenos Aires, despite being South America's biggest Jewish community, at least partially due to historical reasons, and having to fly around Sudan rather than above it? So you spoke about it a little bit, but if you can elaborate.
So there are, well, COVID has kind of gotten in the way, to be fair. But there are direct flights as a result of the agreement with Sudan between Israel and Brazil, which continue on from Brazil to anywhere in Latin America that you want. That was established as a direct result of the improvement of relations between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. The overflight rights that Israel secured from Sudan has facilitated the opening of all that. It's simply, planes have a limit in how far they can fly, and it simply wasn't economically viable before that. It's not an El Al flight, but it is a direct flight. I'm not 100% sure whether it's happening at the moment. It's Tel Aviv, Sao Paulo. You have to understand that the Jewish community of Buenos Aires is a very important Jewish community, absolutely. But airlines are businesses, and they will fly where is economically justified. And business, we don't do enough business with Latin America, but our trade is not what it's all about. There's tourism, there's investment, there are joint ventures, there are other things. Our trade with Latin America is approximately 4% of Israel's international trade, which is much lower than it should be. And of that, 50% is with Brazil. So the flight is a combination of people and cargo. And cargo says Sao Paulo, not Buenos Aires. And from there you transit on. That was the second part of the question. Oh, you were asking about the. So it's a fascinating thing. Kuwait is probably the country in the biggest trouble. I think something like 100% of Kuwait's economy can be connected to oil in one way or another, and there's no question that Kuwait could be in very real trouble if and when we get off fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia is another country which has some very, very real problems ahead of it, in my opinion. But for a slightly different reason. You see Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, even Oman, Bahrain, definitely, they're all tiny countries in terms of population. Locals in the United Arab Emirates is probably barely 1 million people. Locals, there's maybe 8 or 9 million people there, but only about 1 million are locals. Saudi Arabia's got 25 million people. It's a completely different story. 25 million locals. It's Israel exports in dollars more high tech than Saudi Arabia exports oil. It's a dramatic number, and for them to support 25 million people is a huge challenge. But the Emirates itself and Qatar, the others are smaller countries. Bahrain and Oman are not stars. In fact, most of the Emirates are not stars either. There's 7 Emirates. People here probably only know of 2, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. There's another 5 of the United Arab Emirates. They have done a splendid job at diversifying. You've got to understand, Abu Dhabi itself has got about 200,000 locals sitting on, never mind oil, a sovereign wealth fund of over $1 trillion. It really doesn't matter what happens in the fossil fuel industry, Abu Dhabi is secure for the next 1,000 years financially. They've done a superb job. They've got tourism, less than they like to claim, but a significant amount. They've turning Dubai into a miniature Singapore, less than it could be and maybe less than it should be, but a dramatic shipping industry. As a matter of fact, it's fascinating because there's a company called Dubai Ports World, which is originally just the harbor, the Jebel Ali harbor of Dubai. And then it's turned into a port management company. And then it has a contract to manage the harbor in, I think it's Prince Rupert in British Columbia. The harbor is, the port is managed by Dubai Ports World. They've got the contract to manage the port in British Columbia, not Vancouver, north of Vancouver. Port Prince Rupert, is it? Port Prince Rupert, I think. The fascinating thing is, and here is something which I really was happy about 8-9 months ago, prior to my coming out here, there was a big demonstration against Zim shipping coming into Prince Rupert Harbor in British Columbia. And before we could even, before we knew about it, before the consulate, not Montreal, we don't cover British Columbia, but the consulate in Toronto is responsible for British Columbia. Before they even knew that this demonstration was happening, this protest was happening against Zim shipping against Israel, before we could even think of what we should do, Dubai Ports World, which has the management contract for managing the port, picked up the phone to the Premier of British Columbia and said to him, what's going on over here? This is unacceptable to us. The Emiratis placed an official complaint about an anti-Israel protest at their port. This is the relationship that we have built and that we are going to expand outwards to other countries in the Middle East. It's a mutually beneficial, not a mutually dependent, a mutually beneficial relationship where both sides have won so much that we now are going to support each other. The Emirates is different. The Emirates is similar to Israel in our mutual differences from the rest of the Middle East. Some of the other countries will have challenges and are not fully aware of it, but they will have very real challenges and need to diversify further away from fossil fuels.
Thank you. I will combine once again 2 questions. I'm sorry, Mr. Zoland, if I'm mispronounced or if I haven't understood correctly the question. When will the Arab world will stand up to the Palestinians, Arabs and the others? And I want to add to that another question that submitted now, if you can relate a little bit to the BDS happening now or in the few past months regarding the Ben and Jerry syndrome, if you can relate to that, please.
So I have said a few things about that already. I mentioned the BDS, the boycott of Israel, how actually conceptually I mean, look, they pay me to say nice things about Israel. So of course people would, you need to take with a pinch of salt what the kind of things that I say about Israel. But there's an entire school of thought out there of people who think that boycotting Israel is going to bring us to our knees and we're then going to capitulate and give the Palestinians a state or whatever it may be. This couldn't be further from the truth. Not because we've got a big, strong army, which we do have, not because they can't twist our arms, which they can't. The truth of the matter is that in the absence of an agreement with the Palestinians and with the Lebanese and with the Syrians and with, in the meantime, a full agreement with the Saudis and with others, we all lose. Only Israel loses by less. The per capita GDP in Israel is higher than the per capita GDP in Japan. Israel is no longer a teenager. Israel is today a real player. We're not in the first division, but we're a real player on the international stage. The idea that boycotting Israel is going to contribute to conflict resolution is a fallacy. We have proved with the Emirates. I like to believe that I was intelligent enough to see it. The truth is we stumbled onto it. We've proved that conflict resolution is secured by embracing each other, not by boycotting each other. And this is a game changer, which I mentioned before. So, you know, the BDS is, I don't want to belittle it. I don't want to belittle it. I know it's real. I know it's important. It's got to be paid attention to. But you have to understand it's kind of difficult for me as somebody who 25 years ago started doing business in the Arab world, 15, 18 years ago started working on the building of official relations with the United Arab Emirates. I brought the money manager of members of the royal family of the Emirates to Israel to seek out investments in 2006. They have been buying tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of produce from Israel. And by the way, I will tell you that already since 2004, Israel has been importing bathroom tiles and bathroom appliances from a factory in Ras Al Khaimah, one of the 7 emirates of the United Arab Emirates. You've got bathrooms all over Israel, which are constructed with produce manufactured in the United Arab Emirates. It's a mutually beneficial relationship which will bring peace. You asked me about, or you mentioned the question about when will the Arab world abandon or get fed up with the Palestinians. I think I addressed that earlier. It's the exact opposite. The analogy is incorrect, and I'm not going to make the analogy, but the idea of the Jewish community of Montreal abandoning Israel doesn't make any sense. The idea of the Arab world abandoning itself doesn't make any sense. The question is not when is the Arab world going to get fed up with the Palestinians. The question is when is more of the Arab world, because more and more it's happening already, but not enough, going to come to the same realization that we in Israel are coming to, and not everybody in Israel, that the way forward is business partnership. It's interesting because peace, many people talk about peace as being the goal. And now peace is significantly better than war. And in between peace and war, you have a state of non-aggression, which is better than war, but not as good as peace. These are technical terms in international law. The truth of the matter is the goal isn't peace. The goal is much more important than peace, but we can't attain it without peace. The goal is partnership. And that will happen by working together and going through peace agreements. Getting a peace agreement and doing nothing with it is a hell of a lot nicer than being at war, but it's not the goal. The goal is to build things together, partnership. They're not going to abandon the Palestinians, and it doesn't actually make any sense. The idea of them abandoning the Palestinians it doesn't make sense.
Thank you. And that leads me to the last question for this evening on our behalf. You started your conversation with a story, and you said that your goal when you were assigned in Africa was really to elaborate the relationship and to understand why there wasn't any relationship. And you told a beautiful story. I would like to ask, what is your goal now here in Quebec as the General Consul in Canada and in the Azores Atlantic?
Yes, Atlantic.
Please say it in English. Thank you. So please share it with us.
Okay, we are going to be here until midnight. So I'll try and be brief. This is difficult. First of all, I need somebody here to help me. If you can please switch off this COVID pandemic, it will be possible for us to maybe actually reach the goals that I'm setting. It'll be very difficult so long as we keep this pandemic going. It's been brutal, and it's brutalized not only us, by the way, not only the Israeli consulate and not only the Jewish community, probably all communities out there. I'm particularly happy about today's event, actually, because it's so critical and so important for members of community, any community, in our case, the Jewish community, to participate, to go back to shul and to go back to summer camp and to go back to school and to go back to meetings such as this, because it's this withdrawal into this shell is debilitating and dangerous. So I'll say this. So the people, many people think that the two even major roles and goals of the consulate in Montreal or any Israeli consulate or embassy is, on the one hand, consular services, visas, passports, births, deaths, marriage, divorce, etc. And on the other hand, relations with the Jewish community. Let me say this. Both of these two issues are very important and very high on our agenda. But neither of them are why we are here. They are both a function of our being here. The reasons why, for example, in Dakar, Senegal, there are a handful of Jews. There are local Jews born there. There's literally a handful. And yet we choose to have an embassy there. We choose to have our embassies and consulates in locations where there are potentially two things. One is political diplomatic relationships, which we have or want to have and want to nurture and develop. And the other is economic relationships, which we have or want to have and nurture and develop. Once we choose our locations based on those two principles, if there happens to be, like in Montreal, a significant Jewish community, then the Jewish community becomes very important to us for two reasons. One of which is that it's family, and we sometimes squabble. Just like getting back to the story of my friend Ahmed bin Sulaim, who wanted to go to Israel to the World Federation of Diamond Borsot conference and came back and he told the ruler he went to visit the cousins. So this is even closer family. With that, it's cousins. For us, the Jewish community of Montreal are siblings. And that's important. And the second reason is I or my predecessor or the person who comes after me could be the best, and I'm absolutely not diplomat that's ever been. The kinds of relationships that exist between members of the Montreal Jewish community and the wider Montreal, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and all of Canada's community, not from 40 years of being here, from 5 or 6 generations of being here, surpass any relationships I can establish. The abilities, the door opening that is done by members of the Jewish community on behalf of Israel is just dramatic, which is a good opportunity, by the way, for me perhaps to end from my side, because you did say it was the last question, to say thank you to everybody who came here today, because many of you, you know who you are. My friend Jack, who I know is here today, and others have done some tremendous things, door opening and work on behalf of Israel, and it's dearly appreciated. I know we sometimes upset you, like in the last 2 years when we didn't let you into Israel for half of the time. The only thing I can say about that is you didn't let my daughter into Canada, so we're on equal turf there. We don't mean to upset you when we do. take it as part of the mistakes that are made in family relations. It doesn't mean that you're not important to us. Adi, I'm happy if you are. I don't know, Rabbi Whitman. Take another question or to wrap up as you feel.
Why don't I think, Paul, that no matter how long you speak, there's so many questions. And I think the only good solution is to make an arrangement to get you to come back again for another session. And so those people who have not been able to ask their questions, I'll ask you to please hold them for the next time.
Happily, and I'll just tempt you by telling you I didn't tell you the story of my Rosh Hashanah dinner with 3 Muslim families in the United Arab Emirates.
Okay, so let's put a pin on that, and we'll keep that in mind. First of all, Adi, thank you so much for moderating tonight. Adi has been instrumental in the programming of ADAF, along with many other places, overseeing the Shin Shin program, and we look forward to getting our Shin Shinit back soon. This is a program that is so important to us in the entire community, and Adi does a wonderful job. I do want to thank Stu Gutman for wonderful tech support in arranging for tonight, and I want to thank Alvin Delovich, who oversees this program, this one individually, and the entire virtual speakers program. And the tremendous success of this night, like other nights, is largely due to his efforts. Paul, thank you very, very much. The work that you do and that you've been doing for many, many years is simply thrilling. It is pregnant with promise. The opportunities that Israel has today could never have been achieved through other means. And your idea, explaining your idea of the importance of business as a way where both sides can win and where people get to know each other in person, that is so central to the success of Israel today and going forward. The potential, I think, is limitless with that kind of a model. I would add just 2 points. Number one, I think another path that is parallel to that, that also holds that kind of promise, is within the religious realm. Within the religious realm, there is the opportunity to be able to, number one, get to know each other from very different perspectives, and number two, to be able to have a win-win situation as we recognize the humanity and the divinity of each other. Lastly, and by the way, the comment that you quoted a couple of times about your friend coming to see his cousins is a line that I use in relationships with Muslims here in Montreal in our community and in trying to build those relations. And it's good to know that we think alike on that. Wider than that, however, I would just point out that your basic approach to your job and to your life, really, this is not only about Israel, and it's not only about politics, it's really about life. Any kind of conflict, the only way it is going to end is when both sides come to an understanding that they benefit from it ending. There are other ways to stop it short term, but there are no other ways to bring about genuine partnership other than what you have laid out for us. Paul, I want to wish you Hatzlacha Rabbah, tremendous success continuing in the path that you are going. You are a wonderful spokesman for the state of Israel, and we in Montreal are very proud that you are our Consul General. On behalf of ADAF and the entire community, we thank you.